Hey everyone, in this video we're going to learn about NextJS and React. We're going to be writing front-end code that renders some HTML that will be displayed on a user's browser, and code that enables the user to interact with our web application. So some pretty cool stuff. The purpose of this video isn't to make you an expert in React and NextJS, or even kind of a mid-level worker in React or NextJS. We're just trying to get some basic skills, the bare minimum we need in order to mock up a front end. So if you have a great idea for a web application, I'm hoping that you'll have enough here to kind of just mock that up so you can see kind of the entire web application rather than just working on the back end all the time. So that's the goal. It's not to become totally fluent in React or NextJS, but know enough that you can kind of hack together something. So what React is, it's a JavaScript library for building user interfaces. So most of the time there'll be web application user interfaces, and that's what we'll be using here. But it can also be used for developing interfaces for iOS and Android. And it was developed by this guy, Jordan Walk. I think that's how you say his name. He worked at Facebook. It's a Facebook-sponsored project. Or at least that's where a lot of the contributors come from. But contributors are from all over the world, so it's kind of a widely used framework that's built upon many people's work. And the core idea here is that React code is made up of components, and so you can think of you're building nested components, like a nested doll of stuff, much like if you looked at HTML, much like how that works, right? So there's this HTML tags, and within that there's a body tag, and within that there may be a bunch of divs and a form and some other aspects of this HTML. So it's sort of the same idea, is that there are these nested components. Now at the simplest level, these components are functions, like this one shown here, where there's this function title, it takes an argument props, and it returns this little snippet of HTML, the h1 tag, followed by whatever the value of that props dot the worth key heading is. So if we call that function like this, with this JSON, with the key heading, and the value find a campground, it'll construct or return that little bit of HTML, find a campground, and close in these h1 tags. So I'm hoping that's sort of a simple example of how these functions work. Here's a slightly more complex one, but not that more complex really. So we have this function info. It again takes some argument props, and it'll return this div with a heading like props.campground. So we can imagine why we might want to use this if we searched for a campground and now we want to display that campground. Here's a little bit of code that'll actually generate that HTML to display it, right? So it'll give us that heading of what the campground name is and the description of the campground. So if we call that function with that JSON object shown there, campground, Apache Creek, description, a secluded campground, it'll render that HTML shown on the bottom. So kind of cool stuff. So that's a component, that's a function. Components can also be classes. They're class-based components, and they work much like classes in any other programming language. So if you've worked with classes in Java or Python or some other language, you'll find them to be quite similar to this, or at least the structure looks pretty same. Here's an example where we have this class called home that extends react.component, and we have a little constructor there that sets a variable, this.state, and with that JSON object, search key is the key and Apache Creek is the value. And we have this render method on the bottom that simply returns a little, again, a HTML snippet, this time with the h1 campground search and that input field, with the value being this state search, which is what we set up in the constructor. So that's kind of cool. So this JavaScript library, this React, for building user interfaces, does sort of multiple things. And one of these things is it renders basic HTML, is what we've just seen in these previous examples. And it also makes the page interactive. So when a user clicks or types something in, the page can react to that, whether to send information to the web server to get the back-end server to get information and to do a search and render that search information on the browser, or other things. So we can think of it as it does multiple aspects. Originally, React did what was called Client-Side Rendering, or CSR. And how it works is this, that we have a user and she makes a request of our web application. And our web application, if it's using React, just sends an empty HTML document. So that's basically all it sends HTML-wise. And in addition, it sends a bunch of JavaScript files. So index.javascript, app, search. And what's contained in these JavaScript files are things like I've already shown you, like functions, various components, functions, classes, things along those lines. Things, JavaScript code that will execute and render HTML. Now, the distinction here is where does this rendering, this running of the JavaScript code to create HTML occur? In client-side rendering, as you can imagine by the name, that rendering is done on the client's laptop, on the client's computer. It's JavaScript code running in the browser. So all these files are sent to that person's browser, and then that JavaScript code executes and creates this HTML. Server-side rendering is slightly different. So here, a user makes a request of our server, and we still have those files, basically an empty HTML file and a bunch of JavaScript files, but the server itself renders as much HTML as possible. So on the server side, we're executing that JavaScript code and rendering the HTML, and that's what's sent to the user's browser. So it gets a more complete HTML code than it would be with client-side rendering. So again, it all depends, this distinction depends on where this JavaScript code is executing. Is the bulk of it executing on the server side, or is it all executing on the client side? So that is server-side rendering. A few years ago, in 2017, Walmart Labs wrote this article, The Benefits of Server-Side Rendering over Client-Side Rendering, this SSR versus CSR. And here's what I just said in a little bit better detail. These are our pictures from that article. So on the very left, the user sends a request to our server, and the server sends a response back to the browser. And on the bottom row, you can see that that's initially just a loading page. Then the user's waiting for some response to see some response back. And the browser downloads some JavaScript files. The user still is seeing basically nothing. The third thing we do is the browser executes React. The user still sees nothing. It's still loading. And finally, after all that, the page is viewable and interactable, and the user sees that page on the script. So that's client-side rendering, where everything is sent to the client's machine, and then all that rendering takes place. During that rendering time, the user typically doesn't see much on their browser. That's kind of blank. On server-side rendering, it's different, that the server side on the left sends the ready-to-be-rendered HTML response to the browser. So in that sense, that on the bottom left, the user still is waiting for something to appear on the browser. But almost immediately after that, the browser renders some part of the page, some part of HTML. So some part of it's viewable. And then the browser continues and loads all those JavaScript files. The browser will execute it, and the page will be interactable. So in this case, the user sees some information on the page first, and there's a slight delay until that page is interactable. So that's server-side rendering. And this makes the page look more responsive to the user. So on server-side rendering on the left, you see that that those are very small thumbnails of the page as it appears to the user, that appears much faster, that renders faster than what you see on the CSR side. So in about 1.25 seconds, that user sees the page being rendered, can see some results, see the page of what they're searching for or requesting, versus on client-side rendering, it's almost 2 seconds before even just a little bit of that page is being seen. So that's a really big advantage of SSR, server-side rendering. And that's what NextJS is, or it's one of the things NextJS is. It makes React a little simpler in many cases, but it also does server-side rendering, which is a cool and very useful thing. Before continuing on watching this video, it would really help if you went through this really excellent set of introductory tutorials by the themselves, that organization. So if you go to nextjs.org.learn, you'll get to this page and you'll be able to learn things like, the basics of how Next works. You'll be able to write a little JavaScript code in Next that'll render a few pages and go between pages. So you'll learn the basics there. And I'm kind of assuming that you'll have that basic knowledge before continuing with this video. So let's get started with that idea that you've gone through that. What we're going to be working next is we'll get a little Next.js stuff working with React, and we'll learn 2 additional libraries, this isomorphic-fetch, that will allow us to go to a backend server and get some information to display to the user. And we'll also look at another type of promise called a bluebird promise, or a promise library, sort of. All right, so let's get started on that. So here I am in my console, and I'm going to clone a template just to help us get started, and it's this one. So if you go to github.com, Zaharsky next-template.git, you can also clone it and you can follow along. So that's what I'm doing here. And you can see that's not very helpful. And let me just change into that. And you can see that there are the files. They're very simple files, and let's install that. So that's npm install, and what npm install does is look at that package.json file and load in all the libraries that this project needs. Sweet. So that's done. I mean, clear. I love clear. And now let's run it. All right, so our little application is running on localhost port 3000. So let's go there. So there we have it, not much. So it displays a little GitHub image and the words GitHub user search. So let's look at the code that generates this. All right, so here I am in my Sublime text editor, and this is the directory that we cloned. And let me just go to pages and index.js. So here's the file that generated that little bit, that pretty trivial web page that we just saw. So we import React from React. That's not a very exciting line to do. It seems to make sense. And this is the class type component that we've seen before. So I have class component extends React component. I have a very simple constructor function. The really interesting thing here, I guess, is this render method that just returns a very few lines, namely the image that we saw, this github1.png, and that heading GitHub user search. The rest of this is just CSS. And before I go any further, let me just make this a little bigger. All right, I'll call that useful. Okay, so enough playing around with size. Let's go back to the page. So what we'd like to do is we want a search box here, and that search box will type in a person's name, a GitHub user's name, and we'll have a search button, and we'll type in a name, hit the search button, and it'll display some basic information about the GitHub user. So that's our goal for this little demo. So let's get that search box in. Before I get that search box in, let me just add to the constructor here a bit. And I'm going to set a variable, this.state. And it's going to be this JSON object, which has a search term. Whoop. We'll see the use of this in a second. Now let's add that search box, and I'm doing this here on line 14. And I think I'll do that in some paragraph tags. Oop. All right, looks sort of good. Give me just 1 second to change my style here so I... All right, so that should help. So I want input type as text. And here I'm going to have value equals this dot state dot search. And I'm going to close that tag off. All right, that looks good, I think. So we have an input field, and the value of that field initially will be this dot state dot search. And this dot state dot search I defined up here in the constructor, so initially it should be filled with this not Waldorf. So let me stare at this a second to make sure it looks okay, and I think it does, and I'm just going to save it. And you see it does. So here I am back at that page, and it displays our search box, and it says not Waldorf. Hey, so that's pretty cool. So let's add our search box, or our search button rather. So that should be pretty simple. I'm going to do that under this input field. And it's going to be a div. And I'm going to not make it a button input type button, but rather I'm going to just kind of create the button from scratch. So I'm going to call this class name. Button style. And then what I want to write on that button, and I guess search might be a good one. And then I'm just going to close off that div. Sweet. So now I need to just create some CSS style to match this button style. That was my goal of creating that name, class name. So I'll do that down here. And let's just add some cool styling. So margin be let's make a cool looking background color. And since that color is going to be kind of dark, I'm going to change the color of the font to be a white. Okay, that looks good. And let's do how big the button is. And let's change the font of it. And I think that's probably good. So let me go ahead and save that. And go back to and we have a nice search button there, and that little purpley color I like with some Arial text that says search. Sweet. Now, in order to do a search, before we do the search, we need to save or remember what we're typing into this search box. So that's what we want to do next, is write some code that'll remember not Waldorf or whatever it is that we're typing in there. So let's go ahead and do that. So for that, we're going to write another method, and we can call this, let's call it, whoops. And what this simply does is just set that value of the state we defined in line 6 there to the new term. So that'll be this dot state, sorry. And it's the value of whatever event called this function handle update. And that looks reasonable. So we have this function that's going to update this state, the value of search here. All right, so let's add that now to our input button. I'll do that down here. And now I'm regretting making the font so large, but I'll go with it. So on change, we're going to call this dot handle update. Okay, so now we have a larger input field, so it's of type text. The value initially is this state search, and we did that just because we wanted to see something in our search box. Probably we'll get rid of that. And if there's a change to that text box, we'll run this function, this handle update, that we defined up here. So let's go ahead and make sure I save that, and let's take a look at it here. Now, in order to go any further, one thing I should mention is that there's this great Chrome extension that you should probably put on your version of Chrome, and that is React Developer Tools. So if you go here to Extensions, and then just search for React, you'll find React Developer Tools. I already have it installed, and I don't want to remove it, so I'm just going to close this off. Now, if you do that, when you go to get to More Tools, Developer Tools, and we're ignoring errors for the moment here. If we go to this Components tab, that's the components of React. So all the stuff we just learned about, React is components and components and components. We see that here in this very nested environment on the bottom, right, that we can search through. And if I hit Home here, then on the right pane, it shows me what's in state. In this case, the search is not Waldorf. Let me change it to not Waldor, and you see that instantly changes below. So if I change this to some Tyler McGinnis, you see that whatever I'm typing here is also appearing down in that state search box. So this is really useful to see what's going on with your program, and especially once you start getting stuff back from the server, it's kind of critical to see is the error in your request that you're making to the server, or is it in the code that you're rendering? Is there some problem there? So that's a very useful thing. But we see this working, this handle update, because everything I type here is that state search is getting updated as well. So that's cool. And now we actually need to get information from GitHub. So we have to implement this search button. And before I show you how to do that, let me just show you how to search for through to GitHub to get some basic information about a user. So I'm opening up a new tab here, and I'm going to go to API github.com/users, plural users. And then I'm going to type the person I'm interested in, not Waldorf. And you see I get a JSON object back that has all this information about the user, not Waldorf. So that's what we're going to be using. API, github.com, users, and then the user name. So let's go ahead and do that. Okay, so let's see how we can use that information, that API, github.com/user/username in our code to get information from GitHub. So for that, I'm going to create a new folder within Next Template, just so I don't need to put that code in this file, just to have a new file, and I'll call that lib. And I've created that folder now. And now I'm going to create a file in there where I'm going to hold my code, and I'm going to call that utils.js. All right, so I have a file, utils.js. Let's load in that library isomorphic-fetch. So I'm going to stop my server, and then I'm going to do npm install isomorphic-fetch. Sweet. And so I've loaded in isomorphic-fetch, and now we can start writing our code. Okay, so I'm going to require that package that we just loaded in. And if we learned anything yet, we learned that a lot of things happen asynchronously. So when we make a request, we're going to not wait for that request, but we'll create this asynchronous code. So let's do that. So that'll be a function. Let's call it getProfile. profile. And here we'll use that isomorphic-fetch library. It's called fetch. And here we give it the URL. And here we want to put in a person's name. In order to do that, there's kind of a recommended way of doing replacements like this in a string, and that's to use backtick. So let me just kind of create that. Just give me a second to do some fixing of my code here. All right, so in backticks, we can put in variables that will get replaced. So that the syntax for that is this, that we say, and now whatever the value of username is, it'll be automatically replaced in that string. Let me get rid of those dots. All right, so we'll fetch that. And it's asynchronous, but once we get that result back, there'll be some response. All right, so that looks good. So we're going to call this isomorphic fetch. We'll give it the address, API github.com/users/whatever username we type in. Once we get the result back, then we're going to run this function, which takes the response and just returns the JSON object. All right, sweet. I'm going to write a function quickly to handle errors. And I'll just console warn that error. And then just return nothing. All right, finally now we can make this function getProfile available to the other code. Just give me a second for that. So in this module, I'm going to export getInfo. So that's what it's going to be called on the outside. So, but how to execute getInfo would be, it's going to be a function, takes a username, right? So we're going to execute this getProfile, which we wrote up here, and if it has an error, we'll run our handle error function. All right, so that looks pretty good. Let me go ahead and save that. Let me go back to index.js. Now we need to import that stuff we just wrote. So import getInfo from, and then the path to that file we did. So it's up one level because we're currently in pages and we need to go to lib. That looks splendid. Okay, so just like we did handle update, we need to write a handle search, and let's go ahead and do that. So it's an asynchronous function. Why? Because we're waiting on asynchronous stuff in utils.js. Let's call it handle search. Takes the EVT. And the only thing this does then is that looks good. And after that, we want to set the state to be include that information we got back from GitHub. And that looks pretty wonderful, I'd say. All right, and now what we need to do is call this handle search whenever someone clicks on that button. So we'll do it down here, and we'll say on click. And let's just close that off, and I think we may be good. And I have an error in utils.js. Let's take a look at that. Oh, okay. That is... okay, I missed a critical equal here. Let's go with that. See if that works. Okay, and now let's stick with not Waldorf. Okay, and we see now down here in our React Developer Tools under Components, and I'm at the Home component, that now in our state we have this thing called Users, and if I click there, we see we have all sorts of information. So that was successful. So now we're getting results back from GitHub. So now let's say we actually want to display those results. That would be something useful. Let's see how we can do that. All right, so we'll do that in index.js. So now we're getting results back, as I said, and we just need to do some displaying of information. And I'll do that after the button, I guess, but before the CSS. So it'll be here that I'll be displaying stuff. So one thing we want is we only want to display the information once we have the information. So there I'm going to do an if statement. So if we have information, let's display it. And I'll do it this way. So this asks if there is a user. That's the syntax. So if this, then that is kind of the syntax. So if there is a user, I want to display that user's information. So I'm going to have a div that let me close off. And otherwise, I'll display nothing. So that's sort of the code I want to use. But I have to get the syntax correct. All right. So now here's all the info I want to display on the user. So let's say I want the image of the user. And let's just write up some style information here. All right, and now we actually want the URL of the image, and that is in the, if we look at our code here, we see that there's something called avatar URL. So avatar URL is what we'll use. So it's this.state .user .avatar URL. Oop, and I put it in the wrong place. Sorry, didn't mean to do that. And that style tag, I'll just put a break in to get a little bit of formatting. And let's see how that works. So let me search for not Waldorf, and I got her image. That's cool. I would kind of like it to be a little further down, perhaps. Let's do that by maybe putting this in a paragraph tag. I don't know. Let's just put a break. See if that helps. That looks a little better. Okay, so now I have her image. Let's say we want her name. It's the same sort of thing. Let's say we want the name on top of the image. So we would do, I'll keep that break there, I suppose. And let's say I want it in a header 3. And that would be this dot state dot user dot name. This dot state dot user dot name. That looks good. And let's give that a shot. Save it. Go back here, search for not Waldorf, and now we have her name. Let's just add a few more bits of information on her just to see how things are working there. Under the image, let's stick her with a company she works for. And that would be this dot state dot user dot, I think, company. And finally, let's stick in a little bio about her. So that would be, I'll put that in a paragraph tag. And let's see if that works. Oops. And it did not work because I didn't close off the brace. Okay, and not Waldorf. And we get her information. All right, let's try someone else. Let's try Tyler McGinnis. So there we have. So now I've shown you kind of the basics of how things work. I think you hopefully will get some basic understanding of how you can create front ends for your ideas you have for your back end. In the next video, I'll give a few more details, but I think this one was fairly long, so I kind of want to stop here. Thanks so much for watching this video. See you in the next one. Bye.